I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door click softly shut behind the rest of the family. It was one of those rare weekends where everyone was out for the day. My mom and stepdad had gone to visit some relatives, leaving my stepbrother Ethan home. He'd insisted he needed the day to catch up on schoolwork. It wasn't unusual for us to be alone in the house, but something about today felt different. There was a stillness hanging in the air that made every small sound seem louder than usual. Trying to ignore the strange feeling tightening in my stomach, I focused on making lunch. Ethan had been acting distant lately, more so than usual. We were never particularly close, but since our parents married a few years back, there had always been an unspoken tension between us. As I finished chopping vegetables, I heard him coming down the stairs. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if he were deep in thought. He appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, watching me. "Hey, Lily," he greeted, his tone casual, but there was something in his voice I couldn't quite place. "What are you making?" he asked, his gaze steady. "Just some pasta," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Want some?" "Yeah, sure," he answered, but instead of wandering off like he usually would, he stayed, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't fully read. I could feel his gaze following me as I moved around the kitchen, and it made me slightly uneasy. "Is everything okay?" I asked, turning to face him directly. He had that same look in his eyes, one I'd noticed in recent weeks but had never dared to question. "Yeah, why?" he replied with a slight smirk, though his eyes were serious. "You seem a little on edge." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a casual tone, turning back to the food. But suddenly he walked over to the counter, standing close, a little too close. The scent of his cologne was fresh and overpowering in the small space between us. "You know," he started, his voice lowering slightly, "it's just the two of us here today." He paused, and I didn't dare meet his gaze. "No parents, no interruptions." I swallowed, my pulse quickening. "Yeah, I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tension in my tone was impossible to hide. The air between us felt thick, heavy. I turned off the stove and began plating the food, but I realized my hands were trembling slightly, uncertain of where this was leading, and a part of me didn't want to find out. Yet another part, one I wasn't entirely proud of, was curious. Ethan reached out and brushed my arm lightly, and though it was just the faintest touch, it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I stiffened slightly. "What's up with you?" I asked, half joking, hoping to diffuse whatever tension was building between us. But instead of stepping back, Ethan leaned in closer. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, and suddenly I felt my pulse quicken as I began to realize where this might be going. "Ethan, don't," I replied, my voice trembling just enough to betray my unease. His eyes darkened slightly, and for a fleeting moment I couldn't be sure what he was planning to do next. "I'm just saying," he continued, a faint, almost mischievous smile appearing on his lips. "It's just the two of us here. What's the harm in talking?" But his gaze told me he wasn't really thinking about just talking. Feeling a rush of unease, I took a step back, creating a little more space between us. Suddenly the kitchen felt smaller, almost claustrophobic, and the space between us felt charged. His words sounded casual, but there was something underlying them, something darker it left me with the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something unknown. Talking how I replied, trying to regain some sense of control over the moment. I forced a laugh, but even I could hear how unsteady it sounded. What exactly do you want to talk about, Ethan? There was a flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite decipher, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the space between us once again. My heart raced, and I felt the tension between us thickening heavier than before. Come on, Lily, he said softly, but his tone held a note of insistence. You know what I mean. I turned away quickly, grabbing the plates I'd set aside, desperate for an excuse to move away from him. I could feel his presence behind me like a shadow, an intensity that felt overwhelming. I'll take these to the living room, I muttered, doing my best to sound casual. I didn't look back as I left the kitchen, but I could hear his footsteps following closely behind. When I placed the plates on the coffee table, Ethan sank onto the couch, his gaze never leaving me. It felt like he was waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what it was. I sat down at the opposite end of the couch, keeping a safe distance between us. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching it, not with the weight of his gaze settled on me. We sat there in silence for a while. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching painfully long. The tension between us simmered, unspoken but undeniable. Do you ever wonder what things would be like if we weren't related? Ethan asked, suddenly breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he should be saying it. My stomach dropped. This was crossing a line neither of us had really prepared to confront. A question like that, how was I supposed to respond? That's a strange question, I replied, trying to deflect, but my voice sounded weaker than I'd hoped. I picked up my plate, though my appetite had vanished, my gaze drifting as my mind reeled, replaying everything that had just happened. Is it, though? He rested, leaning forward, his eyes intent on mine. I mean, technically we're not even blood related. You're just my stepsister. There it was, a thin justification, an excuse that made his words seem almost reasonable, but it didn't make them feel right. I finally looked back at him, and the intensity in his gaze held me still. This wasn't just a passing moment. He wasn't joking. This was more than awkward sibling banter. He was serious, and that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Ethan, we can't, I started, but he interrupted, his tone soft, almost pleading. Why not? He asked, leaning in closer. Who's going to know? It's not like we're doing anything wrong, we're just talking. That word again, like he was trying to mask what he was really saying, a cover for the feeling that hung heavily between us. I shook my head slowly. It doesn't matter, we're family now, whether you like it or not. This, I gestured between us, my voice catching. This can't happen. He was quiet for a moment, a tension building behind his calm demeanor. When I'd only glimpsed before Lily, he finally said, leaning closer, his voice barely a whisper, I've seen the way you look at me sometimes. Don't pretend you've never thought about it. I froze. His words hit harder than I expected, because deep down I knew there was some truth in them. There had been moments, quick flashes of something I'd always dismissed, thoughts I'd buried before they could take root, but now, sitting here with him, those hidden feelings felt raw, exposed for both of us to see. Stop, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was telling him to stop or trying to silence my own thoughts. He didn't stop though. Instead, he reached out slowly, his hand brushing a strand of hair away from my face, his fingers lingering. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated the way my body reacted, hated that I didn't pull back immediately. Ethan, please, I murmured, my voice trembling. This isn't right. He withdrew his hand, his gaze fixed on mine with an intensity that left me breathless. For a moment I thought he might close the space between us again. But then he leaned back on the couch, exhaling a heavy sigh, running his hand through his hair. You're right, he said finally, his voice low, tinged with frustration. I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. The room felt dense, the silence pressing down on like a weight. We sat there both lost in the same unspoken thoughts. The relief I felt was mixed with a confusing sense of longing. A part of me I didn't want to acknowledge, something disappointed, a feeling I hated to admit was there. We should just forget this ever happened, I whispered, more to myself than to him, trying to hold on to the familiar normally that was slipping through my fingers. Ethan didn't respond right away, but after a moment he nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe you're right. Yet there was something in his voice that made me certain neither of us would forget this anytime soon. The silence between us grew thicker with each passing second. I tried to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to Ethan's words, his touch, and the way I'd reacted. I couldn't escape the uncomfortable truth that in some twisted way a part of me had wanted him to push further. I hated that thought. It made me feel as though I'd crossed an invisible boundary, even if nothing physical had happened. But emotional boundaries can be just as real as physical ones, and it was clear we'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I think I'll go clean up the kitchen, I mumbled, standing up abruptly. I needed to escape, to put some space between us, even if only for a few minutes. I heard Ethan murmur something behind me, but I didn't stick around to hear it. My heart still raced in my chest, the walls of the house closing in on me as I hurried into the kitchen. There I busied myself washing dishes, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the living room, to Ethan, and to what had just happened. How were we supposed to move past this? How could we pretend everything was normal when it so clearly wasn't? As I stood there scrubbing a plate that was already spotless, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Lily, he said softly, standing in the doorway. We should talk. I shook my head, keeping my back to him. I don't think we should, he sighed, a soft sound filled with frustration. We can't just ignore this, pretend it didn't happen. That's exactly what we're going to do, I replied firmly, finally turning to face him. Our eyes met, and I struggled to hold my ground. It was hard seeing the conflict in his gaze, knowing he wasn't going to let this go so easily. Why, he asked, taking a step closer. Why are you so afraid to admit there's something between us? Because it's wrong, I snapped louder than I intended. It's not normal, Ethan. We're family, or at least we're supposed to be. He let out a small frustrated laugh. We not really family, Lily. You know that we didn't grow up together. We barely even knew each other until a few years ago. That doesn't matter, I shot back, my voice shaking. We live together now. Our parents are married. We're supposed to be siblings. For a long moment he looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I could see the battle going on in his head, the same struggle that was tearing me apart. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was About the consequences, the risks we'd face if we gave in to whatever this was. I get it, he said softly, his tone quieter. I do, but I can't pretend like I don't feel something for you. His words lingered between us, and I felt my chest tighten. This was exactly what I'd feared, admitting there was something between us was dangerous, not only for what it could mean for our relationship, but because once spoken, there would be no going back. We can't do this, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It'll ruin everything. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding slowly, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I don't want to ruin anything. I just didn't expect to feel this way. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't let this go any further. It had to stop before things became even more tangled. We need to stop, I said firmly. Whatever this is, whatever you think it could be, it's not real. We're just confused from being stuck in the same house for so long. Once we get some space, everything will go back to normal. Ethan didn't respond right away, but I could see the inner struggle written across his face. Finally he nodded, though it seemed reluctant. Okay, he said, taking a small step back. I'll back off. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I exhaled a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with a heavy sense of unease, part of me questioning if we truly resolved anything. Thank you, I murmured, though my voice sounded strained. I forced a small smile, but it felt empty. He turned to leave, but then hesitated at the doorway. Lily, for what it's worth, I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know. I thought maybe it's okay, I said softly, though we both knew it wasn't. Let's just put it behind us. He gave me one last look before walking away, leaving me alone in the kitchen once again. As soon as he was gone, I leaned against the counter, my head spinning. Maybe I'd managed to stop whatever was happening between us, but the unease still lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There was something unresolved, something that hung in the air between us, and no matter how hard I tried, I knew that avoiding it wouldn't make it disappear. The days that followed were wrapped in a fragile silence, a delicate truce we both carefully maintained. We avoided talking about what had happened, but the tension between us lingered like a storm on the horizon. Every time our paths crossed in the house, it felt like the air grew heavier, like something unsaid was pressing down on us both. One evening, alone in my room, I heard a soft knock on the door. I knew it was him before he even spoke. Lily, can we talk? His voice was hesitant, careful, a tone I hadn't heard before. I hesitated, my heart tightening. But finally I opened the door just to crack. About what? He paused, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that felt almost fragile. I just want things to be okay between us, he said quietly. I don't want things to be weird like this forever. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. Yeah, me too. For a long moment we just stood there, neither of us moving. Then, without saying another word, he nodded and turned away, his shoulders slightly slumped as he walked down the hall. I felt a strange sense of finality settle over me. Whatever had been simmering between us was over, though the tension remained. It was clear that we had both decided to let go, to move forward. In that quiet moment I realized that sometimes the things we leave unsaid speak louder than anything we could ever say.